Let's get started. I, first of all, will introduce myself and then we'll introduce the rest of the panel here. I'm Dr. Brad Bongiovanni. I am a lot of things, but I think I am a well-being evangelist. That's how I would describe myself if I had two words. I'm also an educational champion for the healthcare community in terms of what I do day in and day out, educating physicians and healthcare teams about the data and the information that they need in order to deliver better healthcare for all. And I'm joined by my compadre of 30 years, my co-host, John Chandonnet. So John, let everyone know who you are.
Awesome, Brad. Thanks. Yeah, right. So what do I do? Um, I assist people to consistently cultivate a sense of persistence, focus, and balance and ease in life. And so I assist people to generate their best lives. I've been doing it for 25 years, and I love doing it. We've got a system to do it, to assess, to plan, and to practice well-being in your life.
Yeah, and experiencing it.
And we love doing it.
Cool, thank you. And I'm going to introduce our guest. We're extremely excited to have Jen Fisher. She is the Chief Wellbeing Officer. Yes, you heard that right, Chief Wellbeing Officer for Deloitte. And she's been leading the way, I would say, across the globe for organizational well-being. She's the author of a recent New York Times best-selling book, Work Better Together. She's a podcast. Oh, there you go. Good plug, John. She's a podcast host of a podcast called Work Well, and she's also Thrive Global's editor-at-large for work-life integration. So her charge is, how do I help the people in my organization and other organizations be their best so that they can perform at their best and both the individual and the organization can win? I would summarize it that way. Welcome, Jen. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah.
Great. So the structure, so Brad's going to ask some questions of Jen just to get us going, get us warmed up. And then we're going to jump into it with Jen and understand, how is well-being in the corporate environment relevant? Is it even relevant? What is that?
Yeah, and just so you know, there's no chat function, right, John? I think there's Q&A, so you won't see chat, but you will see a Q&A box that's enabled. So if you have questions for us, we're going to kind of collect them. We're going to go maybe 30-ish minutes or to the 11:30 mark, and then we're going to open it up for some questions. Okay, Jen, are you ready? I have some first things first type questions for you. Think of this as Family Feud Fast Money. First thing that comes to your head. Also, I'm going to say this is a safe zone, so no judgment on your answers. This is just for fun.
All right, let's do it. I love having fun.
Okay. It is, for whatever reason, the last meal you get to eat on your time on planet Earth. What do you choose?
Pizza. Always pizza.
If a movie was made of your life, what genre would it be, and who would play you?
What genre would it be? I don't know. Somewhere probably between like love story and drama.
Who would you want to play you?
Reese Witherspoon.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Did that surprise you?
No, I'm a big fan of hers.
Oh, okay.
I think she's so talented. So, do you have a favorite movie quote?
Do I have a favorite movie quote? I'm terrible at movies. Like, I watch movies and then like a week later I'll tell my husband that I want to see the movie that we just watched a week ago, but I'm great with like book quotes and music quotes.
Okay. Do you have a favorite music quote?
So actually a quote, so one of my favorite musicians, I'm a Miami girl, one of my favorite musicians is Pitbull, and a quote that I used actually on a podcast that I recorded last week is one of my favorite lines from him that says, "You have one life, live it, don't let life live you." So I think that is appropriate for today too.
It is appropriate. And I don't know if you have a yacht, but if you did have a yacht, what would you call it?
We used to have a boat. It was a boat. It was not a yacht. And the name of it was Alegría, which is happiness in Spanish.
Perfect. Okay, second to last question here. If you were running for office one day, what would your campaign slogan be?
What would my campaign slogan be? The future of work means that we work less, not more.
Intriguing, provocative. Okay. And as we open up the conversation, I think it'd be interesting to hear from your mouth how you define well-being.
Yeah, so my personal definition of well-being or framework of well-being outside of the role that I have is eat, move, sleep, and find joy. And so in everyday life, I try to at least do a little bit of all four of those. Eating some nutritious food. But I'm also about indulging when it's time to indulge. I love pizza and cupcakes and anything that has sugar in it. And then movement is really important to me. I am an avid exerciser. I also struggle with my mental health. I have anxiety. And so exercise for me pretty much on a daily basis is one of the strategies that has really helped me with my anxiety. So that's something that I don't negotiate away. Sleep is also something that if you follow me or know anything about me, sleep is a non-negotiable in my life. I don't mess around with not getting enough sleep. My friends, my team, I'm famous for the Irish exit. I just get up and leave and I don't even say goodbye. And I don't feel bad about it either. They just, people that know me, they're like, oh yeah, Jen went to bed. And then finding joy. I think that one has become even more important over the last 18 months or so during the pandemic, and just not even the pandemic, with social injustice, everything that's going on in our world, the 24-hour news cycle is incredibly negative, and it is easy to get stuck in that negative cycle. And but if you look around and you pay attention, there's still a lot of things good about this world, and a lot of ways that you can find joy. And so I try to do that every day.
Yeah, I like to tell people basically the same thing as your last point about basically know and press your own oxytocin buttons. What are they? What brings you joy? Because it's different for everybody. But to really reflect and find out what brings me joy, and then weave those into your life, and carve them out.
And I think for me too, joy, and this might be getting too granular, is different from happiness. I think, joy is more of a state of kind of contentment with life, and being able to look at things in life that are good and positive, not positive toxic positivity, but I think happiness is kind of fleeting, right? Like it comes and goes. It's not a state. So for me, joy is kind of more of a state that I try that I strive for.
So Jen, you talk about joy and joy within the work perspective. I mean, that's kind of a new thing. Talking about fun at work. I mean, in your book, you talk about going from hands to head to heart, from the agricultural revolution through the industrial revolution. We worked with our hands in the agricultural and into the industrial, and then we started to work with our heads as that really transferred into the white collar revolution after the Second World War. And now in your book, you talk about there's a transition in the workplace towards hearts. And so you're saying you want me to bring my heart to work?
I'm absolutely saying that.
Come on.
So yeah, I mean, in the book, we talk about a lot of workplace myths too, and one of those you hit on is that work is no place for fun, right? But it is, and I think the reason we want people to bring their hearts to work, exactly what you said. I mean, I think the fourth industrial revolution, where we've seen, technology is just ubiquitous to every part of our life, and probably more so now than ever, because so many of us have been living and working in this remote environment. But I think also what the technology has done, which we talk about a lot in the book, is it has really hindered our ability to develop and maintain and sustain meaningful relationships with one another. And that's the core of who humans are. That's why it's kind of, the core of our existence, and without those relationships, we don't thrive. And so I think the workplace for many years, I know in my own experiences, we were told that the workplace is no place for emotions. But how do you separate that, right? I mean, it's like, you can't leave your heart at home when you come to work. And I don't actually want you to leave your heart at home when you come to work, because then how, as a leader, how do I know what you're passionate about? If I don't know your emotions, if I don't know who you are and what matters to you, how do I lead you? How do I motivate you? It's no longer about just, coming to work, getting the work done and leaving, right? We are all constantly connected, over connected to the world and the work that we engage in, right? And so how do we know as leaders and as colleagues, like, who someone really is and what really motivates them and what lights them up and what gives them meaning and purpose? And and I want to know that about you. And I come from, I tell the story in the book. I mean, I used to be that leader that was a taskmaster that said, there's a reason why it's called work. We come to work, we get work done, and we leave. And I did not invest in getting to know my people until one day somebody who worked for me came to me and she was like, I have a lot of respect for you in terms of your ability to get, like, you can get anything done. And, and I prided myself on that. I was like, yeah, I can get anything done, but at what cost? And it was a human cost. And that's why she was resigning from my team. She was leaving my team because she told me, she's like, you never invested in me as a human being. Like, you never really asked me what was important to me, how I wanted to develop. And at the time, unfortunately, I wish I had taken it a little bit better and was a little bit more self-aware, but I kind of put up the walls and got defensive, not outwardly to her, but I just, convinced myself in my own mind, the story that I told myself was that it wasn't the right role for her, that it was too intense, based on, her life situation, not necessarily a judgmental thing, but instead of stepping back and saying, wow, what could I have done as a leader and a manager? Because we know that people don't leave organizations, they leave bad managers, right? All the research is there. And that's what was happening. But it took me about 18 months to actually really realize that, and kind of going through burnout myself. And that's all kind of a whole long sordid story for me to have that realization. And I actually called her, picked up the phone and called her 18 months later, to tell her that I had, had that realization, and to thank her, because she had the courage to tell me that. And that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. And you're bringing up, this other side of the coin, for me, because it's okay. I'm sold on what you're throwing down, but how do we create that sense of safety? So if you're the employee and your employer or your leadership wants you to bring your heart to work and your whole self to work, how are you talking to leaders about how you create this sense of safety so that people can feel comfortable, really, and safe doing that?
Yeah. So you have to, and this is, a different skill set, right? When you talk about the different, and, revolutions in terms of agricultural, industrial, all of those things, to me, this is a different skill set that is required of leaders of the now and of the future. And it's something that has long bothered me, and we call these things soft skills, but I don't think they're soft skills. I think they're essential skills, or they're human skills. They're what makes us human. And as leaders, of people, you have to show that same type of authenticity and that same type of vulnerability to create the space and the permission for people to do the same. And so, things that we do at Deloitte, we have, training around art of empathy. We have training around, for our leaders, around, the art of the story, and so really tapping into kind of what makes us human and allows us to connect with other human beings. And so that's empathy, that's storytelling, that's sharing with you a little bit of who I am. Everybody's going to have a different comfort level with that, and that's okay. One of the things that I started doing during the pandemic, and it was actually an article that I read by Brené Brown, or they quoted Brené Brown in it, and she was talking about emotions in the workplace. And we talk a lot about this in the book. And Dr. Susan David is another amazing thought leader on emotions and emotional agility, especially in the workplace. But one of the things I started doing in the Zoom chat, just asking my team when we got on a team call, what are 2 emotions that you're feeling right now? Giving them permission just to put emotions in the chat. I don't need to know why. You don't have to explain yourself, but I'm giving you permission. I'm giving the whole team permission. What that does for me as a leader is to understand, okay, really quickly, right away, I know where everybody's at. And depending on what I was planning to cover on the call that day, I could pivot in the moment to say, okay, you know what? Everybody's feeling, frustrated and hopeless right now. So it might not be a great idea to like dump a big change on them because they're not going to receive it well, right? But also, if Brad, you put into the chat, you are feeling frustrated and hopeless. As a leader, I can go back to you later on and say, hey, Brad, I don't need to know what's going on. If you want to share, that's great. If you don't want to share, that's great. But know that I'm here for you. Know that I'm here to support you. Let me know what I can do. And I think that that's the thing that we've heard the most about emotions in the workplace is, people don't, it's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people because they're afraid that they can't solve. If somebody tells them a problem, they're afraid that they can't solve the problem. For us at Deloitte, we're problem solvers. That's what we do for our clients. And so the feeling of not being able to solve someone's problem for them is really uncomfortable. But the truth is that most of the time, what you'll find is people don't actually need or want you to solve their problem. They just want to know that you're there for them and that you have their back. And so it's kind of getting over, it's practicing it, right? And so we put people in positions and in situations where they have to practice those essential human skills in order to be a leader.
Jen, are we at an inflection point around well-being in the corporate environment? I joined Sapient Corporation in 97, and we were at an inflection point back then in culture where Sapient grew 10x in 13 years because we had an amazing culture that for a services company is really critical to growth. But are we at an inflection point right now around well-being in the corporate environment? Like, help us understand it. You created the well-being position at Deloitte. You are riding the wave. You have been riding the wave and leading it for years. So help us understand that.
Yeah. So I think that we are, and I think to your point, it is all about culture. And so when I talk about my role and people ask me about my role more than anything is actually a culture change role. Because what we're changing is the mindsets, the behavior, we change the mindset, we change the behavior, we change the culture, right? Kind of in that order. And so, I think a lot of organizations are focused on workforce well-being, especially, I think before the pandemic, but especially as a result of the pandemic. I think the missing piece here is that well-being programs, it's not just about programs, right? It's not, you need programs, you need tools, you need resources, you need the right benefits to support your people, but you also need the right culture. And so when I talk to a lot of business leaders, they tell me, well, we spent a lot of money on X or Y or Z, and our workforce isn't taking advantage of it. So they must not care about it, or they must not expect it from us, or they must, and so they automatically kind of write it off as something that's not important to their workforce because their workforce isn't taking advantage of it. And my question back to them is always like, are you sure it's the wrong thing that you've invested in? Or have you looked at your culture? Because most organizations, especially large organizations, but also small and ones that have been around for a while, have spoken and unspoken norms. And these norms keep people from taking advantage of what you put out there for them. And so people truly want permission. They want to know that if I do the things that matter to me in my life, if I take advantage of the resources and the tools that my organization is offering, that it's not just lip service, that this is something that is actually celebrated in our culture. And that's very different, right? And so it truly is culture change. I think we're at a pivotal moment. I think we're at a tipping point. It's interesting because I think that the workforce is actually what's forcing the issue. I think business leaders and in Deloitte's human capital trend for 2021, we did a big survey on business transformation. And the good news is that workforce well-being made it into the top 10 as in terms of things that the C-suite is focused on. However, it was number 9. And for the workforce in the same survey, the workforce would tell you that it was number 2 in terms of what they thought was important. And so there's still a big divide between what the C-suite believes is, in terms of priority and what the workforce feels. But I mean, you're seeing this with the Great Resignation. If you look at the research and you dig into the details of the Great Resignation, for most people that are above the poverty level, the Great Resignation isn't about money. It's about wanting a better life. It's about wanting to find purpose and meaning in the work that I do. And it's wanting to work for an employer that cares about me as a whole person, inside and outside of the workplace. And so you're seeing, I mean, the workforce is forcing the hand. And so I think the organizations that are going to thrive and do really well are the ones that get this in the future, meaning next week.
I really, I see both sides, and I really feel, I feel for especially senior leaders who are trying to manage this, because on one hand, they really, I think, many of them are open to this discussion that we're having. At the same time, they have a lot of pressure and a lot of
they have a business to run.
They have a business to run. Yeah. They're being held accountable by their shareholders and their boards. And so they're trying to balance these things, and they're trying to have empathy, and they're trying to have performance, and they're trying to have compassion, and they're trying to have resilience, and they're trying to encourage their employees to bring their whole selves to work in a safe way. And I end up really feeling for those leaders, because I feel like they're just stuck in this really difficult spot. And so what is your advice to those leaders who are so open to this, but then they also have all these external pressures they're trying to balance?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And so I think number one, there's not this is a hard problem to solve. And I think it's going to become even more complicated for some business leaders, depending on the type of business that they have, as we move into, a lot of organizations are moving into hybrid work. I mean, before I jumped on this webinar, I was having a conversation with a bunch of my colleagues that, I think we're going to make a lot of mistakes and we're going to learn a lot. But I think that that's part of it, right? That's part of innovation and part of being, open to what is coming. But I think it's number one for business leaders, engaging your workforce. That is so powerful. You do not have to make all of these decisions on your own. And as a matter of fact, the best way to change culture is actually to engage your workforce in that change, to understand what they want, what their sentiment is, and have them drive that change. So it's not all on your shoulders and on your back, right? And I think very oftentimes leaders with all the right intentions feel like this is all, they have to carry this whole thing on their back. But the better answer is to actually engage your workforce and to allow them to do that. You said, Brad, that you are a well-being, what did you say? You were a well-being evangelist? Okay. So at Deloitte, we have a program called our Wellbeing Wizards. And it's driven by our workforce. We're over, almost 2,000 strong people that are passionate about well-being. And they're the ones, look, I could sit at the top of the organization with my small team, roll out all the tools and resources and programs and talk until I'm blue in the face. If I don't have people that are living and working in the field with their other colleagues every day evangelizing this, it almost doesn't matter, right? Because they hear it, but they don't feel it. And I think that that's really important. And so you need to engage your workforce in what it is that they want to do. And then I would say start small. I'm a huge fan of micro habits, micro steps, micro rituals, whatever you want to call them, right? This doesn't actually huge, transformational culture change is really difficult if you try to do it all at once. So don't try to do it all at once. Pick small things that will have an impact in a short period of time and then add on to that, right? When we started, everything was a pilot. and most people kind of ignored me because they were like, oh, there's Jen doing her pilot, and so it was a pilot until it wasn't a pilot anymore because people were like, oh, wow, this stuff actually really works. We kind of like it. And then it just wasn't a pilot. So that would be my recommendation.
So Jenny, are you saying that the corporate environment is changing from the triangular top-down approach to a bottom-up where we're actually hearing from people and trying to engage people? Typically business is a zero-sum game. The Wolf of Wall Street, the guy, it's Darwinian, and, it's a zero-sum game. And is that shifting?
I think some businesses are. I don't think they're all there yet, but I think that's the trend that we're starting to see, that that people again don't want to work for organizations where it's a zero-sum game, where they are sacrificing so much about who they are and what their personal life is, that there's I think that probably before the pandemic, but certainly as a result of the pandemic, certainly for me, I think for everybody, we've kind of stepped back and reevaluated like what really matters in life, right? And so I think you're seeing that trend. There's still a ton of work to do. We have a long way to go. And business is business, right? I think for me as the Chief Wellbeing Officer and putting together the business case for my role 7 years ago, because I've been in this role 7 years, and we weren't talking about well-being and burnout and all of the things that are so commonplace, but it was really drawing the picture and making the connection between well-being and high performance. Right. And that's what gets the business leader's attention, right? When you say, okay, if you employ human beings and you care about having a high performing workforce, if you have a workforce that's burnt out and not taking care of themselves, you're sub-optimizing everything about your business. And so laying that out, I work with a bunch of accountants and consultants. So that was incredibly important for me to actually make that connection. But once they made that connection, they were like, oh yeah, you're right. And oh, by the way, every time somebody leaves our organization and we have to rehire and retrain, this is how much it costs. And so do you really want people leaving your organization because they're burnt out, unwell, or don't feel like, they can make their work and their life fit at your organization? Because every time you do that, you're wasting money. And so bringing it down to, kind of figuring out who is the executive that you have to get buy-in from, and talking about it in their language.
Yeah. And Jen, I think there's an important question for you to answer, because what I'm seeing out there, especially the last couple of years, even though the last couple of years have changed, even in this topic we're talking about, is organizational well-being getting tucked underneath somewhere in HR. A lot of times underneath benefits in HR, which I see there's a case to be made, but also explain to all of us out here how a chief human resource officer is different than a chief well-being officer.
Yeah, well, so a chief human resource officer has responsibility for, the entire employee life cycle, from, acquisition, to recruiting, to acquisition, all the way through to when somebody leaves an organization, and all of the HR functions that kind of sit within that. For us at Deloitte, I do sit in our HR organization. However, I would say that HR is responsible for, the ownership of the programs, the policies, the tools, the resources that we develop related to well-being. But the cultural component of it is that I engage with every single one of our senior executives and business leaders, and that there's ownership. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And I do think that the pandemic has had a positive influence on this, is that C-suite executives outside of HR are starting to realize that they all have a role to play when it comes to workforce well-being, right? And so can the programs, policies, procedures, all of those things be housed and run and executed by HR? Yes, but every leader, we have to move beyond kind of standard health and safety, right? And I think that's where a lot of organizations were pre-pandemic. I think what the pandemic has shown a lot of C-suite executives is that they all have a responsibility to help create a resilient workforce, because at some point, let's all hope this global pandemic ends, but we're living in a disrupted world. And, having a resilient workforce is more and more critical than it was ever before, because the disruption is going to continue, whether it's technology disruption from AI, all of these things, right? And as ironic as it is, human beings, even though we're changing constantly, we're terrible at change. But the work world and just the general world we're living in is requiring us, first of all, we're living in more uncertainty than we ever have in human history, right? And so we're seeing the downstream impacts of that. And so creating a resilient workforce spans, across the organization. So what do I mean by that? I'm working very closely with our IT organization, right? Understanding the impacts of digital overwhelm and Zoom fatigue and all of those things. And how can we leverage this same technology that we use every single day that is helping to burn us out to do exactly the opposite, right? I mean, it's a huge and exciting opportunity, but the CIO or the head of IT has to see him or herself in that. The same thing with the CFO. When you look at ESG and all the conversation around sustainability, the thing that's missing there is the human metrics. What about the humans that are burning out and humans that aren't well, that make unwell and bad decisions about sustainability, about how they consume food, about how they consume resources, right? When you're not taking care of yourself, you make terrible decisions. And that has all kinds of downstream impacts. And so how do you get the head of ESG or the CFO or the people that are kind of looking at those metrics and the impact that they have on the organization to see the human impact and what's the role that they play? And so every C-suite executive has ownership in this. I think we need to get a lot more clear as to what that looks like.
How do you start the conversation with a company whose leadership might be open to, what we're chatting about here, but do you start with the CEO, and does the CEO have to have, already a perspective of wanting to buy into this, but just needing help, implementing and executing? I mean, or is the inroad in through the, chief people officer, because they're going to be, this is top of mind for them. How do you begin to turn the ship at the high, when the captain of the ship ultimately is the one deciding?
Yeah. So I think, leadership buy-in and ultimately leadership role modeling the behavior. So not just talking the talk, but also walking the talk ultimately is really important. However, if the top of the house, the C-suite, the CEO, isn't there yet, it is possible to kind of start small and start grassroots and find, who that person is that is going to be your sponsor in the C-suite, right? And go. So from my perspective, the chief people officer feels like a, kind of the right way, because people think of well-being and they think of HR, and that's not wrong. But if there's another C-suite in the another C-suite exec in the organization, or just leader in the organization that sees the value and believes in the business case and is willing to sponsor this, I think you can start small. We talk about in the book, we talk about ways to kind of decode your workplace culture, and there's 4 different workplace cultures, and one of them, well, actually there's a couple of them that are pretty toxic, but the one that we hope that everyone aspires to is trusted teams. And what we found in our research is that, unfortunately or fortunately, it is possible to have a really high-performing team that values both personal relationships and well-being within a toxic culture overall, right? So the team dynamic is really, really important. And what we found in our research is that the team is the group of people that I spend the majority of my time working with, are the ones that have the most significant impact on my well-being day in, day out, which makes sense, right? I mean, the people that we spend most of our time with. And so for those of us that are, full-time working adults, we're spending more time probably engaging with our team members than we are with most other people in our lives. And so they're having a significant negative or positive impact on our well-being, depending on, the culture or the environment within that team. And so I think you can start really small because we all have the ability to influence our team culture. We might not have the ability to influence our overall organizational culture, but you can start with your team and kind of move out from there and collect, show what a trusted team looks like, to collect data within, with what you're doing in your team, and then show that to leadership to say, hey, we did these things and this was the outcome within our organization. And so you don't always have to have the most senior leader buy-in. You would hope that you would. That would certainly make it easier. But look, I mean, that doesn't always happen.
Yeah. No, I love your answer because it's sort of a real world answer. You'd love for it to start at the top and then organize, appropriately, but that's not the world we live in. It's a very organic world. So I really appreciate your answer. Start this way, start here, start anywhere. It really is what you're saying, and then find allies and explore, basically.
Absolutely.
John?
So, yes. So writing a book, that's a big endeavor, we don't.
And the New York Times best-selling book.
Yeah, right. It's not just a book, that 10 people have read. It's a New York Times bestseller. Like, why? That's a big endeavor. It's big taken on. What inspired you to write it? And what was the most unexpected thing that you realized through writing? Because writing actually uncovers truth. And so you often don't know the truth before you start, but you realize the truth. So
so what inspired? So first of all, I would say if you are interested in writing a book, get yourself a really good co-author who's a researcher. So I have the most amazing co-author, and that, the book is about, the value and the meaning, kind of workplace relationships at work and why they're so important. And so, writing a book with another person that you really enjoy being with and value it makes it fun, right? It's not just on your own. And so that would be my first piece of advice. What inspired it? I mean, it's a great question. The truth of that is, my co-author Ann Phillips and I, we were giving a presentation at a big HR conference on the topic because it's something, relational well-being is something that it isn't often talked about or thought about in the framework of well-being, especially in the corporate world, which I find fascinating because it's just, it's core to who we are as human beings. But when we roll out programs related to our well-being, we often forget that. And so it's something that she and I are both passionate about. She's a technology researcher. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the intersection of well-being and technology. And we gave a presentation, and a McGraw-Hill editor was in the audience and came up to us and was like, this is such a great topic. Have you thought about writing a book on it? And we were like, no, not really. We were just going to give this presentation here today. And my co-author had already written, she had just finished writing her first book, and she actually just released her third book. So she's like amazing. She's an animal when it comes to book writing. And so we exchanged business cards, and we kind of went back to our lives and work and didn't really put much thought into it. And the editor came back to us about 3 or 4 months later, and she was like, hey, are you guys going to write this book? We were like, wow, this is a signal from the universe that we need to write this book. And that was in November of 2019. So we started to write the book like 3 months before, at least in the US, we went into kind of lockdown from the pandemic. And here we are writing a book primarily about the impact that technology has had on our ability to develop and maintain and sustain meaningful relationships in the workplace, and at a time when all we had to connect us with most people, including our family and friends, was our technology, right? And so that kind of changed when you talk about truths, right? Like we had to get real clear about how we felt about that technology, right? Because we were dealing with the yin and the yang of it. We were like, okay, on one hand, we are so burnt out, and it has so significantly impacted, our ability to develop these relationships. But at the same time, it's the only thing that's keeping us connected to a lot of people and keeping us connected to our work. And so that there were a lot of really deep discussions on that in the writing, and kind of, a lot of angst and that came out through the writing process related to that, and just a reflective of the times that we're living in.
Well, I want to interrupt for a second because we're at the 11:41 mark. We have a couple questions that we've received. So we have a few minutes left. I think we're going to try to close up here in a few minutes. But one question, which was, I think, excellent, is how does all this apply to small business owners and their very small teams? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I don't see it any different, right? I mean, whether your organization is small or large, if you employ human beings, people are people, and this is something that is important and matters to everyone. Now, your ability to invest large sums of money and things like that might be different. However, I will tell you that some of the most impactful things that can be done from a well-being perspective don't actually cost a lot of money. And so I think that it is equally as important for small businesses as it is for large businesses. How you go about it might be a little bit different. I would actually argue in some ways in a small business, it's a lot easier. I mean, you can get your workforce on a call or sit them around the table and say like, hey, what do we want to do? How do we want to solve this problem? How are you guys, creating that psychologically safe environment where, that's easier to do when you have a smaller workforce, right? Yeah. So some of this stuff actually is easier for a small business owner than it is for a large, but you have to create the time and the space to do it. And obviously that's a struggle for all of us, but I personally don't view it any different, whether it's a small business or it may be some differences in kind of how you go about it.
Great, thanks. And there's another question, Jen, about, we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. In the last 45 minutes, we've covered a lot of ground. If there's one thing that you said for people to take away from this discussion about well-being and how to integrate it into the corporate setting, what would that be? What would that one thing be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really about creating space and bringing humanity back into the workplace, and honestly, celebrating what makes us uniquely human. I think that the work world has done a disservice to a lot of people by creating a lot of fear around technology and AI and the future of work and where that's going. And I think, instead of creating a fear-based culture around those things, actually creating a positive culture around our technology and the ability to use the technology that's available to us and that is coming in the future. We're not going to get away from it, right? And so how do we actually take control of that to make the workplace a more human workplace where we celebrate what makes us human? So where we celebrate empathy and compassion and complex problem solving, and the fact that human beings need to sleep and machines don't, right? But allowing us to sleep and take care of ourselves are what allows us to be innovative and show up in a really human way in the workplace. And that is what I feel like has been missing or has been removed from the workplace. And so moving forward, celebrating those behaviors that we haven't been celebrating because we've been looking at other metrics that unfortunately the expectation has changed, has turned man into machine, if you ask me, right? Like we're trying to compete with our machines, and we can't compete with our machines, and we shouldn't want to, and we shouldn't have to, but we should leverage those machines to bring out what is the best of humans in the workplace and what we do best.
Jen, we're at the 11:45 mark. If you have to go, we will respect it, but there are a couple more questions.
I can go for about 5 more minutes.
Okay, all right. So yeah. I'll make sure we're 5 minutes or less because there's some really good
I'll try to be succinct in my answers.
Okay. the last 18 months, right, been a grind, like we all know. Do you see or are you seeing organizations adopt sabbatical policies for employees, especially maybe more leaders who are just either on the verge of burnout or experiencing decision fatigue? What are you seeing or not seeing out there in that regard?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not seeing a ton of organizations move all the way to sabbatical. You're seeing companies, a lot of big name companies recently have been giving, a week off for the workforce to focus on their mental health, or,
Collective
giving
week off too.
collective week off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, there was an announcement by a large technology company that they're doing mental health Mondays, where you can take a Monday once a month for your mental health. And so we're seeing some of those types of movements. Well, look, I think all of these things are good. I think they go a long way in terms of recognizing that many are struggling with their mental health, that especially over the last 18 months, we need to reframe and rethink about time off and what the meaning of time off is. However, what I would say is I think those are all really good actions to take, but but I go back to culture, right? So if somebody takes a sabbatical because the way that they've been working and the culture that they've been working in is burning them out, and they take a sabbatical and they come back to the very same culture, have you really fixed anything, right? Or are they just going to over time get burnt out again? And so I would just encourage all of us, myself included, Deloitte included, to step back and say, what is it that's going on that is burning us out? And I think part of that is just it's not that it's not necessarily, for some people, their hours have changed. I do think some people are working more hours. I think it's the type of hours, right? It's the fact that we're just sitting behind our desks in front of a laptop all day, and we're not giving ourselves permission to even get up and go to the kitchen and sit down and have a proper lunch. Whereas before, if we were working in an office, nobody really thought about those kind of serendipitous interactions or things that we did. And so it's how we're spending the time. It's not actually how much time we're spending. I do think some people's hours have changed, but in large part, at least for us, we haven't seen a significant shift in the number of hours that people are working, but it's the type of hours that's burning people out. And so if you can do more to change that and permission different behaviors, in addition to sabbaticals and collective time off and things like that, I think that those are great strategies.
Okay. We're going to try to sneak in one last question, which is, I think, very appropriate, because the question is, we've seen a lot of movement in the last year in terms of DE&I. Now, my personal opinion is DE&I and B, belonging, are really components of well-being. And so it's great, but we're still missing the boat on the larger conversation, which we're having today, about how that's a part of well-being. So the question really is, how do we celebrate and weave D&I in to our workplace with well-being and health in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at Deloitte, it is very closely connected and closely aligned. I mean, my simple answer to that is that, well-being is either way you want to look at it. DEI is a core component of well-being, or well-being is a core component of DEI. But I will tell you this, over the last, with everything that's been going on, from, racial injustice to what's going on in Afghanistan to what's going on across the border, right? I mean, all of these things, I mean, there's no doubt that certain populations of our workforce have needed different types of support that are specific to what's going on in their culture. And so I think being very culturally sensitive and having culturally relevant resources, depending on your workforce, is really important to support their well-being. I think about racial trauma, right? That's not something that I myself can understand that experience, but I have a lot of colleagues that's their whole life that they've experienced that, right? And so understanding and having programs that address specific issues within certain populations of people, I think is really important. I think the other piece for me is, look, there's nothing more detrimental than not being able to show up as your authentic self at work. And you hear a lot of organizations throw out the authentic self, language, right? But having to show up and cover who you are and not bring your emotions to the workplace and all of the things that we talked about today, that's the most detrimental thing to your well-being, because you're showing up as somebody else every single day. You're a different person at work than you are in life, and you don't feel like you will belong or be accepted. And that will erode your well-being more than anything that I can think of. Right. And so they have to be aligned and connect. They are aligned and connected, and we can't pretend that they're not.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for sharing your pearls, your experience, your wisdom, your passion, obviously your purpose. We're so excited to have had you join us here. Thank you to the University of Richmond for giving us this opportunity. Thank you, John, as usual. Such a pleasure to co-host these spotlights with you. And for those of you still on, feel free to follow the University of Richmond and the Alumni Association on all their social media channels. Feel free to pick up Jen's New York Times best-selling book, Work Better Together, or listen to her on her podcast, Work Well. You can find John and I on our websites and all over social media, so we're not hard to find. John, hold up that book.
Pick up this book.
There you go.
It's really good.
So thank you to everyone, and God, the three of us could talk about this for another 8 hours, I am sure. But thank you for your time, and keep on keeping on, and you're a guiding light. And so thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you very much. It was a great conversation today.
All right. Thanks, y'all.